Every year, millions of viewers watch Britain's Got Talent looking for the same thing, a moment of transformation. A stranger walks onto a stage, and 3 minutes later, they walk off as someone the whole country recognizes. It's a formula the show has perfected for nearly 2 decades, and in 2024, it found its next headline in a 28-year-old singer from Kent named Sydnie Christmas. What the broadcast gave audiences was a tidy story, an underdog with a golden voice, a golden buzzer moment, and a golden trophy at the end. What it left out was almost everything that made her win: complicated, exhausting, and, for a while, genuinely painful. This is the fuller version of that story. To understand why Sydnie Christmas's audition landed the way it did, you have to understand what came before it, because none of it happened by accident and none of it happened quickly. She was born in Gravesend, a town in Kent that isn't exactly known as a launchpad for West End careers. From an early age, performing wasn't a passing interest for her, it was the plan. She trained formally at the D&B Academy of Performing Arts, the kind of institution that produces working performers rather than overnight stars, and by her late teens she was already doing what most aspiring theatre kids are told to expect: chasing auditions, taking whatever role she could get, and learning that talent alone rarely opens doors on its own. Her early career, on paper, looked far from a failure. She worked on cruise ships, which is its own grueling apprenticeship in stagecraft and stamina. She appeared in stage productions in the UK, and for roughly 3 years, from 2020 to 2023, she was part of the cast of Starlight Express in Bochum, Germany, one of the longest-running and most physically demanding musicals in the world. She started there as a swing, which meant she had to be ready to step into multiple different ensemble tracks at a moment's notice without ever getting the security of a single role to call her own. Eventually, she moved into playing a named character, Carrie the Luggage Car. It was steady work, and it was real professional experience, but it was still not the kind of role that puts a performer's name on a poster. That distinction between being in a show and being the reason people buy tickets to a show is one that a lot of theatre professionals live inside for their entire careers, often without complaint, because it's simply the nature of the industry. But for someone who had spent years training with a specific ambition in mind, the gap between where she was and where she wanted to be started to weigh on her. When her run at Starlight Express ended, she came back to the UK and found herself in a position that will be painfully familiar to almost anyone who has tried to build a career in the performing arts: talented, trained, experienced, and still without stable work. She took a 0-hour contract job as a receptionist at a local gym, the kind of job that pays the bills but has nothing to do with the dream that got her into training in the first place. It's worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it tells you something the highlight reels never do. This wasn't a story about a complete unknown getting discovered. This was a story about a trained, working professional who had already done real shows on real stages in front of real audiences, and who still found herself uncertain whether any of it was going to add up to a sustainable career. That's a much harder thing to process than simple rejection, because it isn't just "no one will give me a chance." It's "I've had chances, and they still weren't enough." By the time she decided to audition for Britain's Got Talent, she wasn't approaching it with the confidence of someone who expected to win. Reporting on her journey has described her state of mind at the time as closer to a last roll of the dice than a calculated career move. She was aware that the performing industry doesn't always treat time kindly, particularly for women, and that every year spent in supporting roles was a year further from the kind of leading opportunities she'd trained for. There's a particular kind of pressure that builds when someone feels a window quietly closing, and by most accounts, that pressure is part of what pushed her to finally try out for a competition built entirely around public exposure and instant judgment. That exposure is worth pausing on too, because it's genuinely different from anything she'd done before. In a stage production, a performer disappears into a character. Even understudying or swinging through an ensemble offers a kind of protection. The audience isn't evaluating you, they're evaluating the show. A televised talent competition strips that away completely. There's no set, no costume that isn't your own clothing, no script to hide behind. It's just a person, a song, and a panel of judges deciding in real time whether what they're hearing is worth remembering. For someone who had spent her whole career as part of something bigger than herself, walking out alone was its own kind of risk, separate from the risk of simply being told no again. When she did walk out, In front of the judges in 2024, she chose to sing Tomorrow from the musical Annie. On paper, it's a strange choice for someone hoping to stand out. It's one of the most recognizable songs in musical theater, performed by countless singers at countless auditions, and it carries the built-in risk of sounding like everyone else who's ever sung it. But the choice paid off, not because the song was unusual, but because of how she delivered it. Simon Cowell, a judge not known for effusive praise, said publicly that her performance made him reconsider a song he'd previously grown tired of hearing. Alicia Dixon praised her presence and personality as much as her voice. It wasn't just a technically clean performance. It read as genuinely felt, and that distinction mattered enormously to a panel that hears technically clean performances every single season. Then came the moment the show is built around. Amanda Holden pressed the golden buzzer, sending Christmas directly into the semifinals without having to survive the usual audition rounds. It's worth noting what that moment actually meant beyond the confetti and the music. Christmas became the first ever golden buzzer recipient in Amanda Holden's history on the panel to go on and win the entire series. For a performer who had spent years being told, in various indirect ways, that she wasn't quite right for the part she wanted, having someone in a position of real industry influence respond with that level of unfiltered belief was not a small thing. It was the kind of validation that doesn't come from applause alone. What the broadcast didn't dwell on, because talent shows rarely do, is how someone processes that kind of moment internally after years of the opposite experience. By multiple accounts, her reaction wasn't uncomplicated joy. It was something closer to disbelief, a sense that the moment didn't quite belong to her yet. That's a common and well-documented pattern among people who've faced repeated setbacks in a field they care about. Success, when it finally arrives, doesn't automatically overwrite years of conditioning to expect rejection. The mind doesn't flip a switch just because the outcome changed. If anything, sudden success can feel disorienting precisely because it breaks a pattern the person has spent years learning to expect. The season didn't end with the golden buzzer, of course. Advancing to the semifinals meant facing a new kind of pressure. Not a one-time audition, but a sustained campaign in front of a live studio audience and a national voting public, week after week. In the semifinal, she performed My Way and secured a significant share of the public vote, a result that made clear her audition hadn't been a fluke reaction to a single well-chosen song. It signaled that audiences, not just judges, were genuinely connecting with her. By the time the final arrived, she was widely considered one of the favorites to win, which brought its own separate set of challenges that rarely get discussed. Being seen as the frontrunner changes the emotional math of a live competition. There's more to lose, more scrutiny on every note, and less room for anything that could be read as a stumble. She was placed last in the running order for the final, which meant sitting through every other act's performance before her own turn came, watching the competition unfold in real time while trying to stay emotionally steady. That's a strange kind of endurance test that has nothing to do with singing ability. Watching other finalists deliver performances that visibly moved the audience, and by some accounts moved her too, in the minutes before she had to walk out and perform herself, required a kind of composure that isn't captured anywhere in a 3-minute highlight clip. Her final performance was Over the Rainbow, a song with its own long history of being sung at high-stakes moments, which added another layer of pressure to get it right. Closing out the show meant she'd be the last impression voters had before deciding a winner, which is an advantage in theory but a significant weight in practice. When the results were announced, she'd won with just over a quarter of the public vote, beating out 10 other finalists. She became the first solo female winner of the show who wasn't part of a novelty act, a distinction that mattered to a lot of people watching who had spent years seeing the show's biggest wins go to comedians, dance troupes, and dog acts. If the story ended there, it would already be a compelling one, years of quiet, uncertain work finally paying off in the most public way possible. But the actual aftermath of her win complicates that neat ending considerably, and it's the part of the story that got the least airtime. Within roughly a day of her victory being announced, the conversation around her win shifted from celebration to suspicion. Some viewers pointed to the fact that she performed last in the final running order, arguing that closing the show gave her an unearned advantage over performers who went on earlier. Others focused on her professional theater background, suggesting that someone with international stage experience shouldn't be considered in the same category as a genuine amateur discovery, and that her win was somehow a foregone conclusion because of it. These theories spread quickly across social media, gaining traction less because of any real evidence and more because that's simply how skepticism moves once it starts. For Christmas, that response landed hard, and it's not difficult to understand why. She'd spent close to a decade working toward a level of recognition that had consistently eluded her, and the moment it finally arrived, its legitimacy was immediately questioned by people who had no direct knowledge of the competition's mechanics. She responded by stating clearly and repeatedly that the competition had been fair, and that the accusations weren't just wrong but genuinely hurtful. It's worth noting how unusual that position is. Most winners of reality competitions don't have to spend their first days of victory actively defending whether they deserve to win at all. What that backlash reveals, more than anything about Christmas specifically, is something structural about how audiences relate to talent competitions. There's an unspoken expectation that a winner should feel like a discovery, a person plucked from total obscurity who beat impossible odds through raw, untrained talent alone. When a winner instead has visible professional history, training, and prior stage credits, some part of the audience feels almost cheated, as though the fairy tale has been revealed to have had a head start built in. That expectation isn't really fair to any performer, because it ignores the basic reality that almost every singer who reaches a competitive final has trained extensively. But fairness rarely slows down an online backlash once it's gathered momentum, and